Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the announcement of a brand new BPC project on ESG. It's always exciting for us to start new exercises, and we've titled this project a lot of different things over the last few months. But I think of it as ESG from ambition to action. Our goal is to bring together a number of corporate leaders who have a shared commitment to advancing these goals and start to really dig into some of the practical questions that will make success possible. Delighted to be joined by our chair, Doug Peterson, who is the CEO of S&P Global. This is a second tour of duty for Doug. We call him a BPC recidivist. He previously chaired a major project on infrastructure, which is obviously still a topic of considerable conversation. We have 5 other companies who are anchoring the effort: Johnson & Johnson, KPMG, Prudential, Invesco, and Chevron. And my colleague Tim Doyle will be leading a panel after Doug and I kick this off with a number of those companies. So Doug, it's awesome to see you. So Doug, you and I have about 15 minutes. We're going to try to do 2 pretty basic things, right? One, we're going to just talk a little bit about the why, what are our ambitions for the exercise, and then start to think about the kind of dramatically changing kind of political arc and how that is now influencing the discussion. So let me just kick it off with what I like to call the Admiral Stockdale question. Some of you may remember 1992, Ross Perot's running mate, Admiral James Stockdale, took to the stage at the VP debate and said, "Who am I and why am I here?" And so, Doug, that's basically my first question to you. What is S&P's interest in this exercise? And talk a little bit about the motivations for helping us launch the project.
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting this, and thank you for bringing us back with such an important topic. As you mentioned before, we worked with you on an infrastructure project a few years ago, which ended up being really, really valuable and successful. And I think we're going to be able to use all of that for the next debate, which is just starting in Washington. So when you and I started talking about the importance of ESG and climate change, we felt that there was not necessarily the level of understanding in Washington of what we've seen around the rest of the world, and it would be valuable for us to get together and kick off another project, especially with this time frame. Just a little bit of background on it. If you go back and you think about what's happening around with ESG around the world, I'll give you an example. Even before the pandemic, there's something called the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, and there's over 3,000 asset managers who have joined, which represents over $100 trillion of assets under management. So this is something that's happening globally. Of those 3,000 companies, many of them are in the United States, so it's not just a global topic. And we felt that with that kind of information out there, with the type of interest that's coming from asset owners, from asset managers, from investors, from financial institutions, that this would be a time for us to get together to think about, well, what about Washington? How do we educate Washington? And with the new administration coming in, we already see interest in ESG and in climate. So think of a better time to do this, and I can't think of a better organization to partner with.
So, Doug, I think just about everybody knows something about S&P, but share a little bit of the role that you see S&P and other third parties playing in this discussion. Why do you care about this other than just wanting to make the world a better place?
Well, first of all, at S&P Global, we're an organization that has different information sources. We have a rating agency, we have an index business, we have another business that provides market data, and then we have an energy and commodities business. And those businesses, all of them are involved in responding to the markets. We have a motto that our overall purpose is to accelerate progress. And we want to ensure that we can do that for people, for the planet. It's also important for us that we're serving the needs of our customers so that they can make the best decisions with confidence and with conviction. And so increasingly, the information that our customers in the markets want to see is about ESG, all of the different factors of ESG. So across S&P Global, we have ratings, we have data, we have climate information. We've got the ability to provide the core data and foundational data that people can use to make their decisions about climate, about ESG, that they use for making investment overseas. And that information complements what we already have in the core information of S&P Global. So this is a natural extension for us and something that the market has been demanding.
We're going to talk a little bit about the question of the quality and standardization of data in a minute or two. But one of the other topics you mentioned just as you opened up was the global reach of this question. S&P obviously has a vision beyond the domestic United States. There is a general sentiment that the U.S. is a couple of steps behind, particularly the EU, on some of these questions. And I think my question is that actually accurate? And what do you see as the benefits and disadvantages of what we seem to be in right now, which is kind of a second chair?
Well, it's almost 10 years ago that I was in a conference in Copenhagen where one of the major themes of that conference was ESG. And at that point in time, this was not a conversation in the United States. It was in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. It increasingly started to go around the world. We saw that with sovereign wealth funds, with asset managers, with pension funds, with central banks, and increasingly started coming to the United States 3 or 4 years ago, especially in endowments, pension funds, and insurance companies, and then increasingly into the banking system. But it's just now that it's starting to become a major topic of discussion. One of the reasons it's becoming a major topic of discussion in the United States around the rest of the globe is that over that time period, there have been many, many different standards that have been set up. There's literally over about 30 different ratings companies providing some sort of an ESG rating. There's many, many different companies providing data and analytics. But then on top of that, there's an alphabet soup of organizations that are providing different types of standards. There's SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. There's the GRI, there's the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. You have the World Economic Forum has a group called the IBC, the International Business Council, that's been working on setting standards. And then you have IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Regulators. So all of these different organizations over the years have been developing different standards for financial reporting. And this is why at S&P Global, we're so interested in it, because what we do in many, many different ways gets incorporated into or uses financial reporting. Now, very fortunately, over the last few months, the different organizations that I named, that alphabet soup, have started coming together. It's like all of these little different streams have become a river. That's something that Mizuno-san from GPIF in Japan said. And by forming a river, we can all start heading the same direction. And this river of flow going the same direction will allow us to converge instead of having multiple fragmented initiatives. And since this is happening very quickly, it's absolutely critical that the United States starts getting to be part of that dialogue.
So this is really the perfect kind of pivot now to this discussion about what the public and private roles are, because there's been a cacophony of enthusiasm around ESG. And in some ways that's terrific because it's a new field and it's creative and you're getting lots of different perspectives. And on the other hand, a lot of people I talk to say, look, I'm getting, 26 different entities rating me differently every month, and it's not providing us or the public, meaningful insight. So, there does, as you point out, seem to be kind of a coalescing, but there's always going to be a competitive instinct. Everyone wants their rating system to be, used and perceived to be slightly better than everybody else's, which is now starting to lead us towards this question of a government role. And I think it's fair to say that while the issue has been really advancing, under the Trump administration, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for having the government kind of enter the field and create standards or obligations or any kind of requirements or mandates. That conversation is now shifting. So let's just talk about this for a couple of minutes. I mean, how do you see the role of the public sector? And what's the benefits of that kind of standardization? And what's the challenge of having a laboring government basically as a barrier to innovation?
Well, it's really important that there is what I call a public-private partnership here. If you look at the public-private partnership that was so incredibly successful last year with the vaccine production in the United States, you had the Operation Warp Speed, and this is something that now we're seeing a benefit from. And if you go back to some of the reasons why ESG has become so important, part of it does come to the pandemic and what we saw last year in many different cases, what we saw with the George Floyd murder. These are things that brought up the consciousness level in the United States really started going up high. But if you start thinking about this question of standards, and I mentioned IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Regulators, it's the securities regulators who can provide guidance and put things into either rules or regulations or laws. but in particular, it would be valuable that all of the securities regulators around the world converge on similar standards or single standards. So you don't see, for global organizations, you don't have to keep reporting differently depending on what jurisdiction you're in. And so the public sector can play a role. It's very important that they're playing a role in setting standards for disclosure, in helping set global standards, working together with the other securities regulators around the world. And you also have in the sense that regulations which are going to be set. So let me go to even a further aspect of this. If we get to the point where carbon and climate aspects of ESG start getting included in global pricing, for example, carbon markets, there's many different ways for carbon markets to be regulated, whether it's a carbon border taxes, or it's a carbon tax, or it's some sort of subsidization of the carbon markets. All of those will require the government to be involved. And so it's really important that there is a dialogue going on between the public sector and the private sector as to how we think about ESG, how we think about climate, and also how we think about energy transition. So great point, and a really good time for us to be working with you to help educate and inform and make sure that we can have that consistent dialogue in Washington.
So I want to ask you kind of to lean into one of the more kind of philosophical questions around ESG. And I think to the extent that there is opposition, it is the sense that this is a social agenda that is being advanced, and people's economic interests in companies are being kind of put in the back seat. How do you think? I mean, the word materiality becomes very significant in this discussion, but how do you see that balance? I mean, what do you think is the role of companies in pursuing these interests? Is it purely based on long-term financial interests, or is it really about a broader sense of kind of societal obligations?
Well, there is a lot in that question, but let me give a couple of different angles. On the first angle, you talk about societal impact and societal information. As you know, the Business Roundtable 2 years ago changed the definition of a corporation, the purpose of a corporation, from just being shareholder focused only into a stakeholder model. And whether you want to call it a stakeholder model or not, what we see is that it's very important for organizations to be thinking about their employees, thinking about their customers, thinking about their supply chain and their communities. And all of these different parts of the organizations are coming to us as corporations and saying, how can you make sure that the sustainability, the long-term impact of how you invest, how you grow, how you run your business is going to benefit all of these different aspects. And the more you benefit your community and your employees and your customers, the more you're sustainable and the more you grow. So it's a virtuous cycle to be thinking about the role of a corporation in this broader way, because it has a longer term benefit to all of the stakeholders and especially to the shareholders. Now, when you think about some of the opposition, there's clearly some organizations and some people that have either a philosophy or an approach that doesn't necessarily see ESG or climate change as a key priority. But just because there's small groups that might not agree with that or don't think of that, A, doesn't mean it's not happening, and B, doesn't mean that there are very large parts of the population that do see these as very important priorities. As an example, there's a set of shareholders who are now coming to companies with shareholder proposals that are putting in place proposals that say, well, I want to see your carbon plan. I want to see your climate plan. I want to see how you're going to reduce your own carbon usage, your own carbon footprint. This year, we're going to see, when we get to proxy season, a lot of proxies that have climate disclosure or climate programs in them, or the S part of ESG, social or employee or diversity questions that are coming from shareholders. So whether or not there's certain people in a political front that say, well, this maybe isn't that important, or they disagree with it, we're all seeing that shareholders are very interested in this, and we're starting to see more and more movement on the shareholder front around all of these topics, and we're going to have to respond.
I just have time for a couple more questions. I think you mentioned the George Floyd killing, and while climate's not easy, in some ways the E is the best defined of our three favorite letters. And I think our effort, in about a month from now, we're going to be having a kind of a deeper dive around carbon disclosure. How does the greater focus now on racial equity, the insights from the pandemic. How do you see that becoming part of a kind of public disclosure process? Can you see a kind of government requirement around the S and the G, and are we as far along there as I think we imagine we might be with the climate question?
Well, let me start with the G, because we are actually pretty far along with the G. The G of governance has been something that for many, many years there's been best practices. That doesn't mean that everybody necessarily follows all those best practices, but already you think about it today in a proxy has a lot of the information that you need to understand the quality of the governance of an organization, their board of directors, their committees, the independence that they might have in their compensation committee, their audit committee. Do you have a split between your executive, between your CEO and your chairman of your board? Does your organization have ways that they look at conflicts of interest to ensure that you don't have conflicts of interest, or if you do, they're managed appropriately? So the G is pretty well understood and pretty well captured. What you do see, though, on the S is that the S is just starting to get measured. There's certain aspects of diversity which you can measure. There's EEO statistics that you could pull out and look at for your organization. There's also aspects of your CR program. Remember the corporate responsibility programs that everybody had over the years. So we're just finding ways now that you can pull out all of that together, add in more information about your supply chain, add in more information about your community organizations, see how you're running your diversity aspects of your company. But none of that right now is necessarily standardized. It's not the same. Everybody's reporting whatever they want. I would say that in my vision, it's not necessarily that the government is going to mandate what you have to have or what you need to look like. What the government would be helping with is setting standards for the disclosure. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to hit this target or that target. The way I look at it is that as we look globally and the different organizations of securities regulators around the world are starting to put in place new disclosure, it's the disclosure that we want to be consistent about. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say what the targets are. It's the disclosure we want to make sure that we can get the consistency around.
Well, Doug, I really, first of all, of course, appreciate your leadership in helping us put this together. I think the disclosure question is certainly going to be one of the, I think, critical focuses in Washington, one of the key questions we're going to be looking at with this project. And so let me just thank you for getting this off to a good start. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tim Doyle, who is going to lead this second panel. Thank you. Tim, we're not hearing you. Never happened before.
Yes, thank you, Jason. Apologize about that. As Jason indicated, BPC is creating this new task force to help BPC be guided through what appears to be a robust policy discussion here in Washington that's already begun and has even before the new administration. With that comes likely new regulation, updated guidance, possible legislation. It appears congressional leaders are already talking about it. So with that, let's jump right in with members of our panel. I wanted to thank you again, panels, for not only agreeing to be today on and talk to us, but also serving as part of the ESG task force. So let me first start by introducing Stephen Brown, who's Senior Advisor to KPMG's Board Leadership Center. Peggy Foran, who is the Chief Governance Officer and Senior Vice President and Corporate Secretary at Prudential. And Glenn Yelton, who is Head of ESG Client Strategies in North America at Invesco. Thank you all for coming on this morning or this afternoon. Before we begin with the questioning, I did want to remind our viewers to please submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using hashtag BPC Live, one word. With that, we'll jump right in, and I'm going to follow up on something that Doug mentioned regarding the purpose of corporations. One of the catalysts to the incredible growth of ESG issues has been the role of corporations in our society. Focusing merely on the bottom line or maximizing shareholder returns seems to have given way to a movement to focus on a broader corporate purpose. As Doug mentioned, in 2019, the Business Roundtable, based here in Washington, D.C., put out a statement on the purpose of corporations. They held that a broader set of stakeholders, and not exclusively shareholders, should be the focus of companies. Well, some saw this as a major change, and I think Doug even mentioned that, in corporate purpose or corporate policy. There are still others that thought this wasn't really a change, but rather a recategorizing of what successful companies already do. That is, that companies, successful ones, already engage with stakeholders at a number of different levels. So with that, first question: how should companies handle this shareholder versus stakeholder discussion, in particular given the economic crisis brought on by COVID, and then how to handle conflicts between those stakeholders? Why don't we first start with Peggy?
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and it's my honor to be part of this incredible group of people. But, you know, I am of that second group that you talked about, and maybe I have been very lucky, but all of the companies that I've belonged to have looked at this. In order to be truly successful, you've got to look at really every group. It's not just shareholders. If you are if you have issues with your community, that's going to hurt you. If you do not have good employee relationships, it's going to hurt you. It's always been good business sense. I think particularly through COVID, companies are realizing that that they're focusing on their community, that they're focusing on their employees, that they're focusing on their customers. And if they don't do that, they're not going to be able to give the shareholders what they're looking for. So, and perhaps this is a larger company, but I don't think so. You know, I've been involved with some mid-sized and smaller companies, and again, it's good business. So I think it's just really brought back, and particularly George Floyd. Again, we're going through this. We're looking at employees now, and shareholders, and communities that want more disclosure. So what you are seeing, and we heard it before, there's going to be a lot more disclosure on those issues because employees are asking, shareholders are asking, clients are asking, and your community is asking. So we're being more transparent and giving that information.
Great. And Stephen, what do you say about that? And in particular, with the stakeholders that Peggy just mentioned, companies are doing, how do you handle conflicts between them? Each have a justification of claiming that their issue should take priority.
Sure. Thank you, Tim, and thank you for inviting me here. It's good to be with everyone on the panel. Your question, I believe, is the hallmark of running a business in a capitalist society. Now, how do you prioritize? And by the way, that's the secret sauce, and that determines who's going to be successful, who's going to be moderately successful, and who no longer is a going concern. So this issue is the hallmark of running a business. You know, how do you prioritize your different stakeholders? How do you prioritize within a subsection of the stakeholder community? I think, and by the way, my perspective is as an advisor at the KPMG Board Leadership Center, but always, and as Peggy knows, and where I met Peggy years ago as a former investor and headed a corporate governance group at a large investor. But what we saw in 2020 is a seminal event in the world, or a seminal event in corporate America, and I believe how we view the corporation in America changes from time to time. It changes slowly, and it changes from the events and culture that we are experiencing. And we certainly saw that in 2020, not simply the pandemic, but racial reckoning. And you mentioned, and it was mentioned by Doug about George Floyd and other issues about racial reckoning in America. So how we view the corporation really is partly determined on how we feel about what's happening now. And so in the United States, we have a definite feeling, and these issues, which were raised by the BRT and sort of recapturing their definition of the purpose of the corporation, have always been there. And by the way, the Business Roundtable did that in 2019. Remember those days before we even thought of a pandemic, before we thought about the big issues in racial reckoning in this country? Because that movement had already been happening. The different stakeholders, whether it's employees, communities, investors, of course, stakeholders, shareholders, and other folks have been looking at the corporation to do more. And as we saw in the Edelman Trust Index, which they do every year, this year was the first year which business ranked first before government, before religion, before many other institutions in terms of trust. So the public trusts corporations more than they trust any other institution. And we need to reflect that. The issue about how do you deal with the prioritization, again, is an issue which is a seminal issue in a corporation. And they've been doing it. Some have been doing it poorly. And I think as we go forward in 2020, I'll end your question with this. As we go forward in 2021, it's really zeroing in on those stakeholders and on those decisions for prioritization, because it does happen where you have to prioritize, and you just have to be clear about how you're going to prioritize, because everyone is watching.
And Glenn, obviously, Stephen's point, I think, is accurate in the sense of that this is a seminal issue for a lot of people that have been talking about ESG is its connection to corporate purpose, of course. So I was curious your thoughts on that, the questions.
Yeah, Tim, again, I want to thank you guys for having me here and a chance to talk with such a good panel on this topic. With this particular topic, there really is an intrinsic link between shareholders and the broader stakeholder groups, and both Peggy and Stephen sort of touched on this in their remarks. That interplay between the stakeholders and their interests, that right to operate, that ability to interact in your community, to attract talent, to retain customers, those stakeholder groups all play into shareholder value. So we have to be aware of that intrinsic play back and forth between those. There's also, as Stephen was pointing out, there is a need to prioritize, and we've seen some shifting of that over the last couple of years as a result of social and environmental issues that we're facing. Those priorities have to be dictated by the overall structure of a corporation, by its driving mission, and by its commitment to its shareholders and to its bondholders there. I do want to point out that what we're talking about in the stakeholder groups, though, those aspects of interaction, that intrinsic linkage, actually ties into ESG a little bit more thoroughly through the concept of ESG integration and that evaluation of material relevant E, S, and G factors in the analysis of a company and the review of a bond. Because those are the extra financial factors, that stakeholder relationship, the outputs, the inputs, the interplay between that really form the foundation of integrating ESG factors into investment process. And that's been fundamental. That hasn't emerged as a result of the changing definition of a corporation. That's been a fundamental evolution of how we're looking at the investment universe over the past 2 decades.
Right. Well, one of the things it seems that does change a bit with time is the definition of ESG, which is part of the reason we thought it would be important enough to put together a panel in this a program in particular. With that, the Biden administration's already demonstrated an interest in a larger government role, as Jason mentioned in the prior session. In addition, not only Congress, as I mentioned, but also the SEC is already moving forward in this space. So the question of the panel is, how important do you think defining ESG is going to be with so many government entities looking at it, and in particular with the Biden administration's a whole of government approach to climate? Why don't we start with Glenn?
Yeah, Tim, definition is going to be absolutely critical. We've talked about the alphabet soup a couple of times already, and ESG is just a couple of letters in that. There's the SRI, there's MRI, there's program-based investing. There's so many different acronyms and terms that are thrown about under this very broad umbrella. The reality is that ESG exists along a spectrum. There is a concept, as I was describing earlier, of ESG integration, which is the use of E, S, and G factors as part of a financial decision-making process. That's about process. That's about ensuring that you've got access to all the data that you need to make an investment decision. That spectrum also encompasses the concept of product, which I think, Tim, is actually where some of the definitions are a bit more critical. The idea of what constitutes an ESG product, what's sustainable, what's responsible, what's green, to ensure that when investors are evaluating these options in market, that they actually are putting their money into strategies that meet those expectations and those definitions. I think that we're going to see some pushback from certain interest groups on very stringent definitions, but we do have a model that's emerging out of Europe with some of the SFRD related regulations, the Article 6, Article 8, Article 9 type definitions that have came into place over the last month that do more strictly define what ESG products can be, what falls under that umbrella. But I think I'm interested to hear what Stephen and Peggy have to say on the topic also.
Well, with that, Peggy, would love to hear your thoughts on it.
You know, I don't disagree with Glenn at all. But I think I would do it a little differently. I think it comes down to disclosure, because I don't necessarily think it's the same for every investor or every stakeholder. You know, I'm a real believer. You're right. I think on the products, you want consistency, Glenn. I truly do. And right now, it's a little bit of the Wild West. At least that's what I think some of our regulators believe. So I think it would be very helpful, you know, and I'm not seeing a lot in that area. And certainly with the SEC announcing that their enforcement division is looking at that, I assume it's because there are no real definitions, and you know, and that's a real problem. I do believe, though, whatever system we have, I think we really have to look at it from, you know, different businesses and different needs. And I'm awfully afraid of increasing, you know, significant disclosure on significant disclosure on significant disclosure from an issuer's perspective. You know, some 10Ks are over 500 pages. You know, do we want some 10Ks being over 1,000 pages? You know, really, what is the critical information? You know, when I talk to investors, and as Stephen has hinted to, you know, I dealt with Stephen many times. You know, different investors have different wish lists of information they want, and different raters have wish lists, and they would, you know, they would like 1,000-page 10K. I'm just not sure that that is at the end of the day, that's the way we want to go. I think what's important from a disclosure perspective is to really look at the material types of things that are important that investors and stakeholders want to know. I do agree with you on the products. We need common definitions. And I also agree that we need a common framework that's flexible enough that it will incorporate the cement industry, the financial industry, manufacturing, etc. And my sense is we're on a journey, and that's going to take quite a while. And I think it's going to take a lot more than the government doing it. I think it's going to take people like the folks that we're hearing from.
Yeah, and to that, Peggy, I know you mentioned the Division of Enforcement. They created a climate ESG task force, but also Division of Examination is going to have an enhanced focus on climate and ESG related risk. Division of Corporation Finance is updating their 2020 or 2010 guidance on ESG disclosure. And then, of course, Acting Chair Lees gave a speech back on March 15th, where she put out seemingly an RFI on disclosure. And in particular, if you get through the 15 that she has listed, at the very bottom, she talks about ESG. Should there be more disclosure across the board on ESG? So Stephen, would love to hear what you think in general about this defining ESG and now being the time.
Sure. And one, yes, the SEC is very busy these days, and rightfully so, because if we take, again, taking the long view and looking at this backwards historically, you know, what makes 2021 such a seminal time in SEC regulations or securities regulations, and I'm an old securities lawyer and securities disclosure lawyer, is that you're hearing the calls for a definition of ESG or definitions of ESG from multiple people, outside and inside the corporation, whereas that might not have been the case a few years ago. What I mean by that is that investors, including Invesco on this call today, are asking for a clearer definition, again, in terms of looking at data and getting that data to use for their portfolio analysis. Inside the corporation, heads of ESG, chief investment relations officers are asking for a definition so they know where, how to meet that definition, right? Securities lawyers are asking for that definition. It is no longer a discussion between what it might be, that play will go on, and that's still going to go on. Should be, what should it look like? Should it look more like what they have over in Europe, or is there an American concept? That's still going to go on. But what's absolutely clear is, and let me use E instead of environmental, efficiency. And that's what securities regulators deeply care about, among other things. As a matter of fact, it's part of our securities regulation format that we consider economic efficiency. And there's going to be efficiency when you have clearer standards in terms of what information that we can use for investors to match apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. And corporations will match that, will need that efficiency, and we'll live up to that. So it's very interesting about how we get here, and how we got here is that there's an efficiency argument for getting standards. What they look like will be interesting, and I believe there will be an American definition. So and it was mentioned earlier in this conversation how much our colleagues overseas are, if you will, more advanced in thinking through these definitions. There's going to be an American concept because we're an American regulator, and we care about things American, and we will make a definition that fits, that's the best fit for us, and it will mirror a lot of what they have overseas, but we'll have an American definition.
Well, and on that, I do want to get to the ESG, the materiality, as Jason had mentioned, and others just have. But before that, I do, because I always get in trouble when I don't, I want to remind those watching online to please submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube or Facebook, or at Twitter, which is at BPC Live. So I know you brought up the European standards, and many have said that they're, and I believe Jason even alluded to this, that they're ahead of where we are here in the States. One of the issues that's come up a lot is materiality. We obviously have the definition. The Supreme Court gave us the definition in our two particular cases. But what we're seeing over in Europe, and now it's starting to get in part of our lexicon over here, is this idea of changing materiality, dual materiality, dynamic materiality. And I think that causes concerns for those that are making the decisions, the issuers or in the corporations, to what to disclose, because if it all is based on materiality and you're changing what the definition of materiality is, that obviously causes a lot of headaches and problems. To that, we mentioned the SEC, and they're moving forward with the disclosure. What a lot of people I hear talk about is that they appear to be moving from a voluntary, principles-based approach to this more prescriptive, mandating approach. And there seems to be some concern. I was wondering if we'll start with Stephen, if we could start with you on that changing focus from a principles base to a more prescriptive base, and how you think that will affect people.
Sure. And I think ultimately the SEC may stay with a mainly principles-based disclosure regime, because that's what they are. I think where they are today is that they're looking at the past disclosure, and it's not enough. They're being told by investors it's not enough, and can you go a little bit deeper to give a little bit better definition? So I think they're going to stay principle disclosure, but it's going to be a little bit more targeted, because that's the way we like to do business. We, meaning in America, and our regulators, like to sort of stay that way with principles based. But it's going to get a little bit deeper, because the calls of concern is that even though you've given us some principles, they still haven't been clear, because our stakeholders, investors, employees, but particularly our investors, still want more. And there's a very big, and we can't, I want to mention this point very clearly, what's happening in our market. There is a big sort of voluntary push by investors. Investors are deeply meaningful and powerful, particularly the large institutional investors. They've been absolutely clear about what they want, and they've written it out, and we can all sort of Google those issues about what they want from companies, regardless of whether it's mandated. So they've been very, very clear. Lastly, I'll say, I think it's important as we go through this process, or as regulators go through this process in the United States, that they simply ask both investors and corporations, what do they think? And we know a voluntary organization, and was mentioned earlier, SASB, the Sustainability Standards Accounting Board, a voluntary organization, nonprofit, they asked. They brought together corporates and investors and other stakeholders and asked, what do you think about materiality according to different industry groups? And the SEC should do the same. Ask and you'll get an answer, and then you'll have the tough job of putting together the answers, coming out with regulation.
And Peggy, and I believe we've talked about this before, based on Acting Chair Allison Lee's statements, and actually from the confirmation hearings of Gary Gensler, who's president's pick and likely to be the head of the SEC coming up, they appear to be pushing for to be mandating a more prescriptive approach. And I know that Stephen mentioned he hopes that they stay in a principles-based. What do you think, or what are you hearing?
Well, I think we're in the first inning, and I think that this is a journey. There's a lot that's going out. I actually agree with Stephen. I think our concept of materiality is here for a reason, and the U.S. in certain instances is different than Europe, particularly in liability. So I think there's some things that we're all going to have to, work through. The interesting thing, though, and I think Stephen brought up an excellent point, which is if enough investors ask, you pay attention to that. Take a look particularly at the Fortune 100 sustainability reports, and I think you'll see a lot of information. Just last Friday, Prudential released something called an ESG summary report that includes a significant amount of ESG information, particularly the S information that investors asked. And the reason we disclose this report is our sustainability report would not have come out to June. So we really wanted to give this information to our investors as soon as possible. Most of this information is going to be contained in sustainability reports. So investors are getting a lot of this information, and most of it, or at least with respect to Prudential, we've been using SASB standards and TCFD. So, it's out there, and we're doing it on a voluntary basis. It's interesting to see how much of it will be mandated in what form. I think also we have to talk about costs, because it's a balance. You can give me a list of 1,000 things you want, and I'll tell you, and then say that not only that all of it, not only the material information, has to be third-party verified. And when I tell you what the price tag is, you may not like that. So I think that's another reason why we have things called materiality. You can disclose more if you want to, but again, there's balances through this whole thing. So I'm hoping we go through this process. People will look at the pros. People will look at the best way to deliver this. People will recognize that perhaps there's a difference between large companies, medium, and small. I'm also hearing about, wait a second, if you want this information from public companies, how about private companies? This is what we're talking about is probably something at least 3 to 5 years in the making. The rules have not even been promulgated, or proposed rules have not been promulgated. Do we really want European standards? Maybe there are some things there that make sense, but as Stephen said, there may be some things that don't make sense for the particular jurisdiction. So will we have rules that will also will build in those types of differences? I think we have to wait to see.
Glenn, you've made some comments today that you think that the Europeans are either a model, or you think we'll be closer to where they are than maybe Peggy and Stephen have indicated. How do you see this developing? Do you view the Europeans as a model that the U.S. should aspire to, or mainly just take a look at and figure out what best works for us here?
Yeah, Tim, I think Stephen's got one really key point, which is we'll want to do it in an American way, right? So the European approach may inform the way that we implement this, but it will be very, very much an American implementation of it. And I've been in this field for over 20 years now in the ESG research and investing side of the house. This is not a new trend, right? The first ESG mutual fund, what we consider a sustainable mutual fund, launched 50 years ago, 1971, when Pax World rolled out their first anti-Vietnam fund. So we've seen 5 decades of interest in these types of data. In the late 90s, we saw the Global Reporting Initiative actually promulgate a set of standards for corporate disclosure globally. That was when the CSR reporting trend started to gain a little bit of momentum. You move into CDP's disclosure structures, into what SASB has done. Over the past 2 decades, there have been standards that have been promoted, endorsed, that have been vetted across industry bodies on what are material and what we're asking companies to disclose. What's been absent has been regulatory requirements or standardized disclosure. To Peggy's point, a lot of companies already do disclose this, and there is a friction to disclosure that has to be acknowledged. There's expense, there's cost of personnel, cost of third-party auditing, and then there's an interruption of workflow, and there's a difference in resourcing available for this from large cap to mid cap to small cap companies. That said, even though companies are voluntarily disclosing it now, one of the things that is a problem is there is no centralized location of that data. It's not in a report that is in one place, like a 10K, like a 10Q. You have to go looking for it, and you have to parse it together, piece it together, which is why we have the promulgation of ESG data providers that we have, the MSCIs, the Sustainalytics of the world. So what the Europeans have done with the SFDR is sort of change and build a structure that's requiring disclosure related to this. The taxonomy that they came out with last year, the SFDR regulations, the NFDR that are pending, give some structure. I don't think that the U.S. will adopt that wholesale. I think there will be some input from U.S.-based global asset managers who are looking to conform what they're required to do across markets. At Invesco, we would not want to do something completely different from the U.S. market than what we're doing for the European market. We'd want some conformity, some standardization, some consistency across those, but they don't have to be identical. So I think it will get Americanized, Tim, and hopefully it won't be 5 years before we see that. Hopefully it will be in the next year or two, because investor demand is there. Products are going to be launched, assets are going to move, even without the structure of disclosure and standardization we're describing.
Well, one question that comes that I've talked to to a number of different people about from a number of different sectors is the sheer volume of frameworks to report. SASB, I think most people would argue, is probably the leader of that pack, but GRI has been out there a long time. I mean, there are a ton of different ones depending on the type of information you're disclosing. And Glenn, I'll stick with you and we'll go in reverse order here. Do you think that there's a disclosure framework that's kind of leading the pack that the SEC might look at as a model?
I think it's SASB, Tim. As Stephen pointed out, this is a framework that has been vetted across industries. We've had stakeholder groups. It has evolved with multiple iterations and comment cycles. I think it's the most mature that's out there. And SASB's been collaborating with other standard makers pretty well over the last 2 to 3 years to ensure some conformity there. I would put SASB as the one that the SEC should look at first.
Sure. Peggy, Stephen, do you agree on that one? That SASB is the probably the leader at this point.
Absolutely. And I probably would throw TCFD in there too. But definitely SASB. But then the SEC has a real issue though, because historically, they really, they don't oversee SASB. So I think that will be an interesting concept of, adopting something but really not being able to oversee, monitor, affect. So the question is, will they develop their own expertise? They're trying to get this done very quickly. They've come out with a lot of press releases, etc. They've brought some people in. They'll probably bring some more people in because this is a very large project that they're trying to undertake. But I do agree, SASB is the most developed, and TCFD, and I think those are the two that, again, we've looked at them all over the years. We've tried some of them. We're also part of the integrated reporting group years ago, and I thought that helped us really understand the issues. But I think from a corporate American perspective, I think there's no doubt that SASB is the way to go.
And Stephen, I know that we do you feel the same way on the point about SASB, but in addition to that, the SEC, are they capable of doing this? If you read through Allison Lee's 15 numbered request RFI from that March 15th talk that she gave, and you look at the subparts of each of those 15, you get a sense that the SEC is not really sure what they're able to do in this space, or what they want to do without maybe more resources. I mean, because this could really be, and to Becky's point, an enormous undertaking for the SEC to do it to the way that I think you all on the panel agree. Stephen, what do you think?
Sure. And I'm not going to take the bait and choose one of the acronyms. I think they all have their merits. But most importantly is how you heard Peggy frame her answer, which is they've looked at all of them and they've made some decisions. And I think that's important. And that's what I tell clients. You can't make an educated decision if you don't understand what you're looking at. That's the first thing, because if I were an investor, I want to know the 3 to 5 things that truly matter to your long-term production of value, and how, from an E and S perspective, what's material. That's deeply important. Whether or not these acronyms and the alphabet soup existed, I would want to know that, and that's what folks are going to have to focus on. And when we think about that other acronym, the SEC, look, I don't work for the SEC, but on their behalf, I would say yes, they need more resources. They always need more resources. Actually, here it's a benefit to the entire market community, investors and corporates, when we have more resources so they can look into this issue and do what we said earlier, which is a sort of drill down on standards. And the other thing is that, by the way, I mean, the SEC does regulation. It has always done regulation. And it has the troops that they're provided by Congress to do that. What's different here is that there's so many stakeholders who are asking for this regulation. And this is how, when you think of Gen Z, when you think of millennials, who make up the bulk of employees in America, including the bulk of employees at government, at the SEC, they care deeply about this. So I think this is something in which, if you ask them to work overtime on, they will. That's what's so interesting about this subject. Now, everyone cares about it. What regulators need to do is sort of stay in their lane and help define what they should care about from an investor standpoint, what they should care about from a regulator standpoint, what they should care about from running a large corporation in American society.
Well,
Yeah,
Tim,
Stephen,
if I can follow up.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, if I can follow up on Stephen's comments here. I feel like we're circling back to part of the materiality concept here, because there are a lot of stakeholder groups who are asking for this type of data. There are a lot of different interest groups that have their own priorities. But where the SEC is providing the oversight, the relevance for most of these factors is going to have to come back to materiality, its impact on the profitability and the performance of a company, the impact ultimately on shareholders or bondholders of the firm itself. And that's where I think we circle back to that need for that key definition. And to some of Peggy's points earlier, that helps publicly traded companies to sort of focus their resources. Invesco is a publicly listed company. We want to know what to disclose, how to disclose it, what the framework is. We're asking for that data from the companies that we invest in, but we also want guidance and guidelines on how we respond to. We do a TCFD reporting, we do our CSR reporting, we do our stewardship report. It would be nice to have a little bit more structure, and we do focus on those topics that we feel are relevant and material to our shareholders and to our stakeholders, including our internal stakeholders.
Yeah, and to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here, when you talk about the shareholders wanting this information, that certainly is playing out in a number of companies, but not all companies, and not to the extent that I think that some people argue. That is that there are a number of shareholder proposals that come up at their annual meetings, and they don't get but 30-40% of the vote. So there is an argument to be made out there that it might not be as desired as those that are kind of pushing the ESG narrative, that it might not be as strong. Peggy, have you heard things like that? Is that just the naysayers, or what do you think?
You know, Tim, that's a good question. You know, I do know this fall that we engage with about 60 of our largest investors and stakeholder groups. And I would say the vast majority of them were asking about the S, you know, particularly about racial equality, what our commitments were, our EEO1 reports, you know, our breakdowns, you know, how we're going to measure our commitments. And so that was one of the reasons we put the ESG summary report out. There was also some on climate, but I'd have to say that it took, it was not the number one, but it was certainly close with number two. And it could be because we actually disclose a lot of our environmental commitments and where we are on that. So I don't know. You know, I don't know if, you know, I do know in Europe you saw some, say, on climate. In the U.S. we had several of those proposals. I think everyone's looking at them closely to see how they will go. I suspect next year you'll see a lot more of, say, on climate, and I think that would, you know, that to me would tell you what's on the minds of investors, you know, and the larger investors and the reasonable investors. You know, again, you know, as Glenn was saying, Invesco asked for the information. And to the extent that they're looking for it, you know, that's one of the things we took into consideration. We will increase disclosure if we think it's important to stakeholders or investors. And again, it's within that realm of materiality. So the answer is it's certainly, there's a lot more people asking for it, but I don't know what the it is. You know, I think we come back to that definition. When I talk to investors, there's some that want this information, some that want that information. That's why I think it's really critical to have a framework. There's very few analysts I've ever met that didn't want more of anything. That's just, you know, that's just the way the life is. That's their job. And, you know, it makes it a lot easier if you put it one place, easy, so that they can get it. I have nothing against that, but I think we have to look at this as really what's the critical, important information that investors and stakeholders can look at consistently, and not necessarily telephone books.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look back and you look at the Supreme Court cases that dealt with materiality. One of the issues that the justices were concerned with was too much information. What if the investor is overloaded with this? And remember, it's a reasonable investor standard. Now, the large institutional investors that I know that Stephen, you mentioned, and others have mentioned, they have the resources to sort through. They probably like, give me more information, the more the better. But when you're talking about a reasonable investor, maybe not so. And so it's a balancing act. Is it not, Glenn? What do you think?
It is a balancing act, but there A reasonable investor needs to be made aware that some of these factors can impact the valuation of a company that they're considering. And that's part of the education, to Peggy's point, that's part of the definition, ensuring that we are communicating clearly in a very demarcated, delineated way what is material, relevant, and impactful that a reasonable investor should be aware of. And there are some things that we know there could be materiality associated with in different companies that are already structured for standardized disclosure. We've mentioned the EEO-1 disclosure a couple of times today. EEO-1 is something that every single company files. This is a form that's been in place for a long time. They're not made to publicly disclose that. An easy move for someone like the SEC is to require public disclosure of EEO-1 data. A second area, Peggy, to your point on climate, is actually Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Those have clear definitions that are decades old. It is not difficult for a company to disclose that. And the reality is they can be material for a reasonable investor. If there is a price of carbon, if there's a friction in the market associated with high emission, a reasonable investor should be aware of that.
And Tim, if I could add,
Absolutely.
Great question around. It's not for all investors. Investors want a lot of different things. But what I would say is, first of all, a 30 to 40% vote, which means it doesn't pass, even though there's a precatory vote, is still significant. And you would not want to know where on that issue shareholders are trending, right? Because it tells you something. Now, I'm going to say something that contradicts all of this, which is you take all of that data over the last 25 years and you take it and you should put it in one place, at least, and then throw it in the garbage. Because I believe what we said at the beginning, that 2020 was a similar event in corporate America. I do believe it is. I want to look at the data this year, 2021, and how proxy season goes and look forward. And that's because when we look at shareholder voting, the large investors may not have voted for something because they're very particular in how it's worded. A proposal is worded, it doesn't say enough, or maybe they have the information. And so the better the proposal is worded, and we've seen that over the years, that proponents get better at doing this writing, the more there is an inkling that you could possibly support. The other thing is that those large investors that are publicly traded are themselves feeling a lot of pressure to show their work. And so no longer would it say, hey, we believe in the issue, but we're not going to vote for it. There's a lot of pressure on that. So I want to see what this year's proxy season looks like. And that should give you a really good sense of what I call investor sentiment. And it's no different if you're running for public office, local or statewide or national-wide, where you do ask, what's voter sentiment? How do the voters feel? Same thing here with investors. What's the feeling of investors around a particular issue? And even though it doesn't get 50.1%, now what does it look like about their voting percentage versus the last few years? Is that ticking up? And if it is, that should give you some concern.
So, Stephen, do you think we're going to see? Oh, sorry. Do you think we're going to see more, say, on climate proposals?
I think so. Next year and going forward. And again, part of this is that these take a while to have a formulation that works. And so we'll see what happens this year, proxy season, and then there will be a discussion amongst shareholders about what works. What has happened in 2020 also, quite frankly, is that shareholders since 1992, the SEC said you can meet and discuss issues around corporate governance, and that's not collusion. So the SEC and guidance made that clear many, many years ago. Well, there has been no meeting and gatherings in 2020 because of the pandemic. They've been doing it virtually, but you really can't do it virtually. It's sort of when you get together, and we all know of the organization which we deeply care about, CII, the Council of Institutional Investors, has not been in person, where investors and corporates can get together in a social setting and have that conversation. That hasn't happened. And so I think that slowed down a little bit of this sharing of information on what really makes sense and how something should be worded. So let's see what happens at the end of June, the American proxy season, and where things lie. But I think you will see more climate-related resolutions that will be very specific, that will be the supporting information will be rather intelligent and involved. And so it'll be very interesting from that point.
But Stephen, you do have to admit that if a proposal doesn't get 50%, there are costs that are borne by the corporation for these proposals that come up every year, the same ones over and over and over again. I know the SEC addressed that, or the prior SEC addressed some of that. Do you not see that as a concern, or do you think that those additional costs, or those annual costs, if you will, in many cases, is just part of doing business, and something, to your point, it's okay to do because you can then see the trend that the investors are looking at?
Well, I think the SEC said, this SEC said they will look at that. But under the regime we have now, and those old rules, they were looking at what they felt were relatively low thresholds. And I can't remember them, but they're all single digits for the most part, in terms of when you can repeat a proposal. And it's, again, if I use that word earlier in our discussion about why we should look at getting standards, I have to use that word efficiency in this context, meaning, what's worthwhile again. And those are relatively, when something gets relatively small vote, and it's not 30 or 40%, it's much smaller, you have to think about whether that particular proponent can submit it the next year on that issue. But from my standpoint, or for advising boards and companies, is to look at trends and where's that sentiment going on a particular issue. I think is deeply important.
Right. Well, on that, we've talked about climate change here quite a bit, and companies are making both now short and long-term business decisions based on that. How do businesses factor that in, especially when you're talking something that has an event horizon, arguably quite a few years in the future? I mean, large corporations, of course, plan out 30 and 40 years, but what about mid and small corporations to be asked to have a climate plan about something that is going to happen? They might not even be around, as some of them would have argued to me. Is that not would it not be better to put their resources somewhere else? And I'll go to Glenn with that one.
Yeah, Tim, that's actually a challenging one, because I'm going to keep coming back to materiality. So there are industries where climate and the impacts of climate change are going to be very material to operations, to productivity, to profitability over the next 2 decades to 3 decades. And there are others where it's really not going to matter at all. And asking them all to do exactly the same level of disclosure, I think that's a bit of a fool's errand, and it's inefficient to play off of Stephen here a little bit. But where it is material and relevant, even for a small and medium-sized publicly traded enterprise, there should be some planning, there should be some disclosure. And one of the offshoots of requiring the creation of a climate plan is requiring an entity to actually look at the issue realistically, thoroughly, and determine what the impacts will be. And I personally think there are sectors of the market where climate risk is really not disclosed in a way that is appropriate, that there is unpriced risk in the model in certain sectors as a result of an opacity into this particular topic. And
Peggy, this one, I guess, to you, but on the same kind of the same topic here. For those companies that are not or do not believe, and maybe the better thing, that their climate assessment, climate risk is going to be that impactful, how do they determine? I mean, as this, and it go to Stephen's point, I think, and Glenn, I think that everyone here, is it goes back to materiality. If a company determines something is not material to disclose, or that they believe they've sufficiently addressed it in their other disclosures, as I think Commissioner Roisman has said, there is climate disclosure. There are a number of regulations currently on the books that companies would have to disclose under. But so the question to you, Peggy, how does a company deal with that then? How do you? Is it not in the end up to the company to determine what is disclosed under the materiality standard? Because it appears that some of the administration, some of the SEC are talking about that it's not. If you listen to Gary Gensler's his testimony in his confirmation hearing, he almost made it sound like he was changing the standard and that materiality was not something that a company determined, but rather what the SEC determined of what a company had to disclose.
Well, ultimately in the U.S. we have as I say, everyone deserves the right to make a living. We have plaintiff lawyers. So to the extent that you fail to, disclose something or you omit to disclose something, there are private consequences on that. There's not only the SEC that may give you a comment or do an investigation, but I really do believe, based on our system, it really all comes down to materiality. And there are the governors, as I said, there are the regulators. Generally you go through law firms, you go through your accountants are taking a look at this. So there's various folks that are looking at that are helping you form what your materiality is. And again, if you don't get it right, there is a private bar out there. So I really and truly do believe it comes to materiality. We know materiality. We've worked with materiality. I, like Stephen, am SEC, a securities disclosure lawyer. So it's something that, you make decisions based on that. I think I do agree with what Glenn is saying, though. Again, 2050 is a long way out, and so I think you really have to get creative on that. I think a lot of companies are, again, they're not denying it. What they're saying is, I need to take some time to really figure this out, because it will take a while. I mean, if something is really material, you know it. If water is going to impact you, you know that. If climate change is going to impact you, if you happen to be, you buy property in a flood zone, that's probably something you better be focusing on disclosing, and probably talking to investors that are going to be asking you questions on how are you going to mitigate those types of things. If you've had issues with your employees or the organization, again, you're going to get those types of questions. So I unfortunately, I think it goes back to materiality. I don't know. I think a lot of us are going to have to learn a lot if we go to things like a dynamic materiality.
Yeah, that standard, well, the materiality standard, I think that's, as I mentioned earlier, why people are concerned as that definition gets tinkered with, gets changed. I think that it becomes, and maybe this is the purpose, it becomes what you argue it is. And to your point, Peggy, if you're wrong, then there are ramifications to that by investors and suits. But in the end, I mean, we have a board for a reason. They that are there to make sure that the management is assessing that which needs to be assessed in this. But Glenn, in the end, though, the company will have to make these determinations. I know Peggy had mentioned that they need some time. I think when it comes to, for instance, climate, I think there's a lot of people out there that argue you've had time. Like people have known about this issue for quite some time. Like you can't be a corporation and say, well, I really didn't consider climate, or I haven't yet considered climate. It's only now that with this administration we consider it. So Glenn, how would you recommend, or what would you recommend companies do with that, coming right out front and saying this is how we're addressing climate? And if so, is that a disclosure, or is that not in some other form?
Well, I think that there has to be that assessment, the evaluation, and then the communication. The assessment is a challenge. Even though this is a topic that is not new, we've known, I think IPCC first convened in 1988, so we've decades of data related to this. The models themselves are still emerging in sophistication. So it's really hard to make location-specific climate predictions even now with the data. So the assessment needs to take into account the limitations of data. Once you've done the assessment, done your planning and the communication, I think the communication, Tim, has to be probably in a disclosure. And I say that because it is material to investors and valuation and risk. And a disclosure that provides equal data to all investors is going to be critical. That's the way that we avoid any of the non-material public information risk, that we ensure equal access to information for all reasonable investors, and everybody's at a level playing field to act on. I do think, to Peggy's point, and Tim, to yours a little bit, there's a little bit of a board responsibility here. We do have the boards for a reason. They should be providing guidance and direction to management on this topic and how to approach it. That's part of their responsibility in the governance structure. I think some board members are still struggling with the concept, just now getting to a realization that it's not something you believe in or don't believe in. It's data, it's science. There are models that are bearing out what the impact is going to be. So there are multiple layers here. I think, though, finally, Tim, that in a disclosure structure, Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions we can easily measure and report on. Scope 3 is very challenging when we move out beyond the company's direct control. I think anything that includes Scope 3 requirements is going to be problematic for a while. And I do think that any disclosure related to this needs to zero back in on the applicability of the data and the risk to the company itself in the context of the climate scenario. And there does need to be that element of disclosure. What's their scenario? Is it a 1.5 degrees? Is it a 4.5 degree? Because using the model that you use and the math that you use, you have very different results and evaluations of the impact on the company.
We have, or I have, and I'm sure that those watching have so many more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I'm so glad the three of you have agreed to be on our ESG task force. We will have you back. We will ask you both online, offline for your opinions. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And with that, I wanted to thank all our listeners. BPC will be back, as I think Jason mentioned at the beginning of this segment. We have these. This is a continuation of series on ESG. The next one will be on climate risk disclosure. So many of these topics we will dig down to even deeper on that. For that, I wanted to thank everybody again and have a good afternoon.